Welcome. Welcome to PSHS 6240, week 3. I just want to review again this past week and preview the next week. So start off with announcements. Paper due next Sunday, depending on when you are watching this. So just keep that in mind. It's due 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then Group 1 will go next Thursday, or this upcoming Thursday at 9 p.m. I just want to mention the grading. The grading for the paper is going to be a lot harder than you might see for the discussion sections. Discussion sections, I want to give you some leeway to think and to write. The paper, there's going to be far more stricter criteria, stricter rubrics for the paper. So keep that in mind. Don't get insulted if you don't get 100 or something like that. No one gets 100. Don't get insulted if you even get a lower grade than 90. I think I owe you critical feedback on your papers and your analysis as your instructor. So current events, I think everyone's still locked in COVID-19. I just want everyone to kind of follow what happens next as we start opening up. Will the infection rates increase? Will they decrease? And there's a lot of theories out there. The prominent theory is that infection rates will go up no matter what because of lack of social distancing, and what happened in New York a month ago will happen in Kansas now, and etc. But actually, I think there might be different statistics. I don't think you can compare maybe New York to other cities. New York is a high density dependent on public transportation, a lot more spreadable avenues for New York than maybe a rural area. So are we going to see that line increase, or are we going to maybe be able to better target COVID-19, meaning we can target those who are in vulnerable areas or who are vulnerable. We can target those whose work makes them vulnerable. Meat packers seem to be big. Other people who might have to work in close proximity. And then can we do a test trace combination? That's what we need to look at going forward. And I'll be right now, testing is critical, and I don't think we're getting the job done in that respect. And I'll just leave it at that. Or I won't leave it at that. I will just say there is analysis out there that says we're testing the wrong people, that we're testing those who are sick. And in fact, what happens is you go in, you say, I'm sick, I'm coughing up blood, I've been sick for a week, and then you get a test. Those people should not be tested. Those people should automatically assume they've got COVID-19. The people that should be tested are people who are asymptomatic but might have massive contacts or other reasons that they might be more vulnerable. That's the one thing I hope to look forward to, or hopefully our testing capacity can increase to compensate for that issue. And then the briefings, I mentioned on Thursday. So Group 1 is in the chute. Please send your slides to me beforehand, before 9 p.m. on Thursday. And I will send a WebEx link. What it'll do is it's just a login. You'll just log in from your computer, just like Zoom or anything else that you may have been using, and then I'll push the slides, and then you'll present from there. So review of last week. I'm going to push out an example paper. So go ahead and pause me now and go to the next paper or next YouTube video that was sent with this one. Okay, so welcome back. And what I emphasized in that video and emphasized in that going forward is those argument points, those criteria that you determine why one thing is terrorism and why or why it belongs to something else. That's where I want you to focus your paper on. Please expound on that in detail. And some of the argument points that were brought up in the discussion, and some of them that are just out there, military versus non-military. This is a debate whether targeting military is terrorism. Almost everyone here said USS Cole was terrorism. I think most people said the Fort Hood action was terrorism. But according to the National Counterterrorism Center, that's wrong. That only targeting civilians is terrorism or non-combatants. So that's something to consider going forward. Combatant versus non-combatant. This is something I didn't consider until maybe about last year, but we had the 9/11 Pentagon scenario that I assigned, and some of you said, well, there might have been military in the Pentagon, but there were non-combatants. There were civilians there. Well, were they non-combatants? They were working in a military building that were alongside or planning for war, planning for military operations, or supporting that in some respect. Were they non-combatants? Were the civilians at Fort Hood that were killed in the Fort Hood shooting, were they non-combatants? I mean, they were prepping people to go to war. Arguably, those are combatants. I will let you decide whether they're combatants or non-combatants. State versus non-state. Many people brought this up. You have state actors tend to belong in the more declared war or war. Non-state actors tend to follow terrorism. But again, there's problems with that logic. One, there are state actors that support terrorism. Iraq or Iran, Pakistan, Syria, Venezuela to a lesser extent. And then you also have to say, well, just because it's a state committing violence, does that automatically absolve them from terrorism? Is it just because we assume a state is going to use a Tomahawk missile or some sort of fighter aircraft, and therefore that's not terrorism because that's not a low-level tactic? There's problems with that argument. That's saying like states can't be instruments of terror, when in fact they can on many facets. Targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. This was brought up in the FLN, the Irgun arguments. The FLN targeted people only in Algeria. Arguably, that makes them less of a terrorist organization. If they took it a step further and targeted the French in Paris and Marseille and in main cosmopolitan France, perhaps they would be considered a terrorist organization because now they've taken their actions a step further. If their actions are confined to the locus of conflict, perhaps that takes the argument away from them being terrorists. Attacking the apparatus of government. I brought it up in the Mandela case. One of the reasons why Mandela is considered a martyr or a folk hero in some respects is because his planned terrorism, and he targeted people, don't get me wrong, he wanted to use violence to achieve his objectives. But he was targeting the apparatus of oppression, the South African apartheid regime that was oppressing the African American minority, or the African minority in South Africa. If Nelson Mandela had killed civilians and bombed pizza parlors and other soft targets, I don't think people would consider him a hero or a martyr, regardless of the cause that he was bringing forth, how just his cause was. So certainly attacking the apparatus of government or even the apparatus of oppression is far more justified than killing civilians randomly. War zone versus non-war zone. Many of you brought this up when you talked about the IED attack in Iraq. It was in a war zone. Says you, would be my response. If you're a soldier of Allah, like the Fort Hood shooter claimed he was, certainly Fort Hood is in the war zone. That is part of the war zone for you. In the USS Cole example, you might not think it's a war zone, but certainly if a destroyer comes up on your harbor or your little area there, that's a war zone to you. And let's take the IED planter. For the IED planter, his war zone is that road that he's blowing up that convoy in. When he goes home, he doesn't consider himself in a war zone. He considers himself back at his home. But you, if you're targeting him, would consider him going, still in the conflict area, even though he's going back home. So what is a war zone? What is not a war zone? That impacts what a definition of terrorism is. A political narrative. This separates arguably a terrorist from a common criminal. And we have to look at the mass shootings here. Arguably, some of the mass shootings that involved ISIS, like the Orlando shooter, or white extremists, like in South Carolina or in El Paso, they had a political narrative, while others, like the shooting in Columbine or the shooting in Sandy Hook, didn't have a political narrative. That's arguable. That guy in Orlando, you can argue he had a political narrative, but I also suspect he was severely mentally ill, and he was not trying to do anything except to bring attention to himself. So what is a political narrative, what isn't, is something that you can argue. Levels of oppression. Certainly, if you're highly oppressed, like you're in the Holocaust, or you're Jew during World War II in Europe, or you're, I mean, we could even say now, the Uyghurs in China, or the Armenians during the First World War, where another state wants to not just oppress you, but exterminate you, certainly you are justified in a certain level of violence. So then the next question that comes up, what level of violence are you, and what level of oppression do you need to take in order to exact that violence? If you want to make an argument, ISIS is allowed to engage in violence because of the oppression they receive on the Iraq side and the Syrian side, the Sunni oppression in that area. That's taking the argument to an extreme, but that's just to illustrate the point of levels of oppression. Politically popular versus non-popular. Arguably, if you're politically popular and your cause has popular cause, your violence is more insurgency than it is actual terrorism. Degree of association. This comes to a lot of these ISIS cases where ISIS isn't funding and planning and coordinating them, or right-wing extremists aren't funding, coordinating, planning them, but they're being radicalized on the internet and radicalized in other areas. Is Omar Mateen, the Orlando shooter, is he associated with ISIS just because he pledged allegiance after the fact? Is the guy who opened up the shooting in El Paso associated with the various right-wing extremist groups? Or the Charleston shooter associated with various neo-Confederate groups? Even though the neo-Confederate groups didn't plan and coordinate with them. Again, is that terrorism or is it just random violence? I'll let you decide. So the paper, again, what I'm looking for is kind of this format: intro, argument, rebuttal arguments, policy recommendations, if there's any. So that's kind of the paper format. So you have the intro, you have your argument points, rebut those arguments, and then wrap it up with policy. And again, some illustrative examples. The Irgun, highly oppressed because it was part of the Jewish following the Holocaust. Their violence was focused on the apparatus of oppression, the British mandate at the time, and occurred within the locus of conflict. Again, you saw that in the video. The FLN, maybe you move down the terrorism spectrum a little bit more, highly oppressed, but they killed a lot of civilians. They did a lot of nasty things to civilians, but it was still within the locus of conflict. And then Al-Qaeda, not really oppressed. This is in the pre-9/11 age. Focus on civilians, the 9/11 attacks, and they're obviously, if their beef was the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia, which you'll read about this week, their attacks definitely occurred outside the locus of conflict in New York and Washington and other areas. So that's kind of, that kind of illustrates where the terrorism spectrum goes. So if there's questions or issues with the paper, please let me know. I'll be happy to discuss it on Thursday as well if you want to sit in on that group. But for now, just moving to week 3. Again, we can't take breaks in this class because it's the compressed schedule, so we have to go right ahead. Terrorism History Part 2, The Road to 9/11. So you have the documentary and the Zakaria article. And as you're going, think about the social, political, demographic, and historical and cultural factors that led to 9/11 and some of the anger that you saw after 9/11. So, pending any questions, I look forward to your discussion points, and I look forward to seeing Group 1 on Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.